This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin, bringing you stories of capitalism. This week, the new era of populism and what it means for global economics, plus failing into space, how competition shapes innovation. But first, we begin with a story about tough love, a local government, private sector leaders, and city residents making hard decisions to fight off a troubling trend.
We can't have more people die of overdoses in our streets than were affected by COVID. I mean, this is crazy, and the numbers continue.
Amit Moghadam is the CEO of Prologis, the largest logistics real estate company in the world. He founded his firm in 1983 in San Francisco and has seen the city's ups and downs as a businessman and as a resident.
San Francisco was a very different place in 1983, but it was not all great. We were just coming off of the assassination of Mayor Moscone, Harvey Milk, and the AIDS epidemic was raging at that time. So we always remember the good old days, but there were certainly problems in those days as well. What was different was that the San Francisco business community was much more engaged and committed to the city. You had some large companies like Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Chevron, PG&E, and the list goes on. Levi, of course, a San Francisco-based company. And there were a couple of individuals who were really civic-minded leaders in the community, people like Warren Hellman, Chuck Schwab, Walter Shorenstein, and Don Fisher, that really were running significant businesses. And then really, because of the passage of time, those companies either moved to the suburbs or they moved out of town. And over time, they were replaced with companies that were less committed to San Francisco, including a lot of tech companies in the last cycle, social media companies, et cetera. So I think that corporate core, if you will, hollowed during this period of time, and the commitment declined as a result of that. So I think that's the big difference.
For San Francisco, as for many other major cities, the trend that began years ago was made far worse in 2020.
I remember right up to the pandemic, I mean, the downtown was so booming, you literally couldn't walk on the streets. So, you know, the vacancy rates on the offices for high-tech companies was, you could barely find anything. So we were absolutely booming. Now, that said, though, I think that boom, it kind of covered up some glaring problems that we weren't facing.
Chris Larson is a lifelong San Franciscan and has founded several Silicon Valley startups, among them the digital payments company Ripple.
San Francisco really suffers from sort of being a representation of a certain way of life in America. So there's a little bit of a pile-on that goes on, right? Whether it's Trump or whether it's some of the local folks that are trying to run for mayor here. There's sort of some glee in sort of trashing the city.
For many years, San Francisco was a magnet for people and businesses, growing from 1.8 million residents in 1950 to 3.2 million by 2000. But then the growth leveled off and actually turned negative during the pandemic, driven by a range of factors that can lead to what economists call a doom loop.
The idea of an urban doom loop is that it's a force that feeds upon itself, that we have a decline in urban property values that then perhaps leads to a decline in local tax revenues, which leads to a decline in the ability to pay for public safety or maintain other amenities, which then wraps around again and pushes prices down further, leading to lower tax revenues.
Economist Ed Glazer of Harvard has made a study of urban doom loops and what leads to them.
We can take it to be a sort of a larger metaphor for the way in which things start to fall apart when things start to fall apart. So by which I mean, in general, people move out of an area, it becomes less attractive for other people to move in that area, it has higher vacancy rates. All of these things then continue to push people away. So again, it's the idea of something that feeds upon itself and becomes almost an unstoppable wave.
Public safety also looms large in the potential decline of any city. And it's been a major issue for San Francisco, which saw a jump in shoplifting and commercial burglary from 2019 to 2022. Since the pandemic, stopping criminals and punishing them has become a subject of rising tension.
We have policy on the books that if you steal less than $950 from a store, you basically get a parking ticket. It's a misdemeanor. I mean, that has encouraged a lot of theft in the city, and that needs to get changed. There was a gross receipt tax that was enacted that really is a burden on business. So the list goes on and on.
In June of 2022, Hamid Moghadam was mugged at gunpoint when two armed men stole his Patek Philippe watch in broad daylight while he was outside of his San Francisco home. Afterward, he wrote a letter to San Francisco Mayor London Breed saying, quote, "I recognize we live in an urban environment, but the level of crime, including violent behavior, has become absolutely unacceptable. But beyond endangering people, crime also has very real economic effects."
I think there have been various estimates that something on the order of $3 or $4 trillion a year, if you add up all of the different direct costs to victims as well as indirect costs in terms of just our sense of fear when we walk around a neighborhood and not wanting to go to certain neighborhoods after there's been some crime incident.
Jennifer Doliak is the Executive Vice President of Criminal Justice at Arnold Ventures, where she studies the economics of crime.
I think in general, mayors would be best served by thinking about this in a way that takes a more scientific approach, perhaps. I'm a researcher after all, that's going to be my advice. But focusing more on promising to find a solution rather than claiming to have a solution up front. The reality is a lot of these problems are really hard to solve. Most of the things we're going to try, even when there's some evidence from somewhere else, aren't going to work. And so the goal often should be to fail fast rather than not fail at all, so that you can keep trying something else. And that's very different from the standard politician's approach, which is just to say, I've got the answer, and then not acknowledge when it doesn't go quite as planned. One big thing that we've learned from a lot of research over time is that increasing the probability that you get caught for crime is by far the best and most cost-effective way to deter crime. And that's as opposed to the punishment. I think for a very long time, the United States thought that, just having really long prison sentences was a really good way to deter crime. Turns out most criminals are not that forward-looking. So increasing the probability that you get caught has a really big bang for your buck.
Increasing the odds of catching criminals necessarily means better policing. And for San Francisco, that's become a key challenge in recent years.
And I think we're today operating with 1,600 cops, which means that there's a lot of overtime and a lot of our officers are overworked and they're getting frustrated, and that's leading to more of them retiring early. And actually we have been bringing fewer cops into the system from the academy than they've been retiring. So the problem has been going in the right direction. It's not a matter of pay. I think we pay we're one of the highest paying areas for police, but the police feel that they're not appreciated. They don't have the tools to do their job. We don't have license plate readers. We do for a short period of time, but we've really fought license plate readers, the use of drones and other technologies. So the only way we can leverage a smaller police force is to apply technology and help them. But most importantly, it's a perception problem. Nobody wants to be a cop when everybody thinks that you're the enemy of the city or the enemy of the citizens.
Technology can be a big help here. So a lot of cities like London use surveillance cameras around the city, and that has a big impact on being able to catch offenders when they do commit a crime. Other technologies like DNA databases help us match DNA from crime scenes to offenders that are in the database, and a whole lot of new technologies that are being invented every day. Now here the trade-off often winds up being between the big benefits, the big crime reduction benefits we see, and what we might perceive as privacy costs, right? So if we're increasing the probability that people get caught, we're doing that by keeping better tabs on people. And that can be scary to people. That can trigger concerns about privacy, and those concerns are totally valid and worth discussion. But I think it's also important to realize that our status quo practices, the alternative to using technology, putting police on every street corner, for instance, that is not costless when it comes to privacy, right? And so standard investigative techniques without using technology can often be very invasive for victims' private lives and other people's private lives. And so technology in that way can actually be a huge game changer and really beneficial.
Crime gets a lot of the attention, but it's not just public safety that can make a city less attractive. It's also whether people are moving in or moving out, and the occupancy rates, particularly for commercial real estate.
Our traditional measures of urban growth and decline are things like population growth, housing price changes, income changes, and I like to look at permits, building permits, as being a sign of how much people actually want to move into the city. I think all of those things are useful metrics. So in our list of 50 metropolitan areas, where we just form a sort of naive statistical index of those 4 measures, San Francisco was last out of 50 metro areas.
I am less optimistic about the future of downtown San Francisco. That will take some effort, some serious effort. San Francisco has a lot of fintech and a lot of technology companies. Those are the companies that actually lend themselves to the work from home phenomenon. And this is a difficult downtown to commute into. You got to basically cross a bridge, go through a tunnel, or come down a very busy freeway to get in here. Very few people actually that worked in San Francisco lived in San Francisco proper. So as a result, COVID really affected the city more than other places.
To thrive, cities also need to be attractive to business. And that means having economic policies that balance supporting the population without imposing too heavy a burden on employers, particularly through taxes.
I think it's incredibly important. I think you've got, that's where the resources come from. The resources come from the businesses, the resources come from the taxpayers, right? And you need to make sure you keep the city to being an attractive place for them, just as you use them as a resource to take care of the poor. In some sense, there's a metaphor that I like sometimes with city governments, which it can be useful to think of a city government as being sort of a for-profit real estate company that's owned by a not-for-profit poverty alleviation company. And so the not-for-profit poverty alleviation company is in the business of trying to figure out how to make the lives of the poor better.
There's no doubt that San Francisco has had its share of challenges, but those who know it best are often the first to point out how much it still has going for it and how much its past strengths give it a strong foundation to build a brighter future. Up next, the rise of populism and measuring its economic impact. That's next on Wall Street Week.
You're listening to Bloomberg Wall Street Week with David Westin from Bloomberg Radio. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week with David Westin from Bloomberg Radio.
This is a story of populism, what the people want, what the global economy needs, and how the two can fit together. The interests of the people. It's been the clarion call of populist leaders through history, and one we've been hearing more and more often in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere. But why did it happen? And what does it mean?
Populism, to me, is the alternative when an individual or political parties actually capitalize on individual situation where they don't really have a visible path for economic opportunity and growth.
As the former U.S. House Majority Leader, Eric Cantor, watched as populism grew among his constituents in Virginia and across the country during his 13 years in Congress.
You look around America today, and it's an amazing country, very dynamic. There are pockets of extreme growth and innovation and prosperity, but it's not equally dispersed across the country. And I think in many ways, populism serves as a substitute for individuals who aren't necessarily accessing that tremendous growth engine.
Populist leaders might seize on major geopolitical events like pandemics and mass migration to justify their calls for dramatic change. But they come against the backdrop of longer-term trends, like large parts of the population getting left behind while some of us recover from setbacks. For decades, inequality in the United States and parts of Europe has been on the rise as more money has become concentrated among fewer people. In the 1970s, the top 10% of earners took home about a third of America's income. Today, it's closer to half of all income. And wealth accumulation has also become more skewed in favor of the rich. That inequality has unsettled workers around the world. Over the past couple of years, auto workers, farmers, and dock workers have picketed to have their wages raised. In the U.S. alone, more than 500,000 workers walked off the job in 2023. That's a 141% increase from 2022.
There comes a point in time where you've been abused enough, you have to stand up for yourself, and this is it. This is our generation's defining moment. Either we turn this around now, or we're going to be in big trouble down the road.
Our fight is with these foreign-owned carriers that have made billions of dollars on the backs of longshore men and women for too long.
There's nothing new about populism or its appeal. In the United States, it's at least as old as Andrew Jackson, 7th president, and champion of farmers, mechanics, and laborers. People who distrusted national institutions like the central bank because they felt left out of the progress being made by others in the early 19th century. America saw populism rise again with William Jennings Bryan during his crusade against the gold standard and what it was doing to farmers. And then in the 1930s, when the U.S. plunged into the Great Depression and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt pursued a New Deal on behalf of the people and against the entrenched elites of Washington and New York. Now populism is seeing a resurgence in the United States under Donald Trump and in Europe under leaders like Marine Le Pen and Giorgia Meloni. The Tony Blair Institute for Global Growth reports that the percentage of countries with populist leadership has gone from less than 5% in 1992 to nearly 20% today. Economists like Tito Boeri at the Bocconi University in Milan evaluate the causes of populism and the long-term effects of its policies on countries' economies.
We have seen that the roots of populism, the factor behind their success, are very much related to the consequences of a number of shocks that have been hitting our economies. So first of all, the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009, and then also the pandemic.
When I was in office, that the populism of the day was the so-called Tea Party. And this was, I think, the initial surge in what we now have on my side of the MAGA movement. And these were people who really had otherwise not really been involved in the political process, had come into it largely due to social media and the ability to gather together much more quickly and to identify each other's, commonality. And back then, the Tea Party, if you remember, it was taxed enough already. We discerned that maybe that was due to the overarching reach of government, and that government had gotten too big and we were spending too much money in Washington. And so our prescription to respond to that was to try and really stick to a course of fiscal discipline, try and return the fiscal imbalances back to some prudence in Washington. I think what I have seen since being off Capitol Hill is that notion that somehow there was a philosophical underpinning to the rise in populism really wasn't necessarily what was going on. It was just some real anger.
In Europe, like in the United States, populism has deep roots going back in time. Agrarian groups have supported populist ideals for centuries, but modern-day populism gained support in Europe after World War II. In France, the populist torch has been taken up by Marine Le Pen and her National Rally Party, campaigning against immigration and for greater security. Even without being elected, her party has changed the landscape of French politics.
Back in 2007, Nicolas Sarkozy actually won the presidency by campaigning on Le Pen's themes, immigration and security. And this was probably the first time that politicians realized that by really adopting and embracing their themes, they could win.
In the most recent elections, President Macron outmaneuvered Ms. Le Pen, depriving her of the ability to take over control of the parliament. But the populist wave swept the European Union's parliamentary election in June, giving her National Rally Party a surprisingly good showing, while Germany's far-right party, Alternative for Germany, entered parliament for the first time with 15 seats. Historically, the economic track record of the most extreme populism has been clear. One doesn't have to go back to Juan Perón's Argentina in the 1950s, when inflation raged and the peso collapsed, to see the failures of populist policies. President Trump's imposition of tariffs on goods from China, Europe, and even Canada did not lead to the resurgence of domestic manufacturing that he had predicted. And America's economic growth in recent years was made possible in part through increased workers coming from abroad. But whatever the consequences of populist policies, it can be a mistake to see populism as simply a question of economics. Whenever the movement regains traction, it's been about more than just the pocketbooks of voters.
I think for a long time economists have not understood the cultural roots of populism. The fact that beyond their message and their popularity, there was very much this claim to preserve the national identity, the national values. These are things that economists have started really looking at carefully only in the last 10 to 15 years. We were clearly more looking at the economic performance, broadly speaking, and clearly that doesn't give you an answer to the question why populists are there and why mainstream parties are finding it hard to survive under the pressure of populist parties. Because if you look at the economic performance of countries where populists have been in government, think about the Latin American experience, but also more recent episodes of in which populists have been in government in Europe, the outcomes are generally very bad for the country. You get recessions, depression, hardship, devaluation, inflation, large fiscal deficits. So all the measure we could possibly, or unemployment, we could measure of disease, of hardship for the population are there. And yet this populist party, perhaps not the same person, but the same narrative, the same people survive over time and actually are still very, very popular.
If our experience with populism has taught us anything over the years, it's that it's not going away because it is based in part on legitimate concerns of large segments of the people who feel they have been left behind. The question is whether this quest for greater equality of opportunity can be melded with other political forces to come up with some better answers.
Look what's going on in Europe. I mean, their political systems are being torn apart by the rise of some of these parties on the right and the left. And I think those who have been successful have been able to merge and tap into this anger that is fueling the populism. And we'll see whether they're able to merge that with the more traditional, if you will, commitment on the right to fiscal conservatism or to national security. Versus trying to say we are just going to focus on here and now, and the fact that America is the global superpower that we are doesn't really matter, and we're just going to tend to the home front. We haven't yet seen where we can successfully merge the two, but I think that's the formula that ultimately could work and could enable our country to arrive at a new consensus going forward.
Still ahead, creative destruction and the decision that revolutionized the modern space race, here on Wall Street Week.
You're listening to Bloomberg Wall Street Week with David Westin from Bloomberg Radio. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week with David Westin from Bloomberg Radio.
This is a story about competition. Competition between private companies and competition between private companies and the government, all for the ultimate prize of space travel.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And liftoff, Falcon 9.
Going into space is unbelievable. It was a yellow sun on a black sky, floating in zero G. It was just an extraordinary experience.
Investor Victor Vescovo went to space on Blue Origin's new Shepard 21 mission, putting him in the Guinness Book of World Records as the first person to achieve what's been dubbed the explorer's extreme trifecta: a trip to space, to the top of Mount Everest, and to the bottom of the Marianas Trench.
And I've just always been drawn to exploration and seeing what's on the other side of that hill. And when I was 3 years old, my father plopped me down in front of the black and white television, and I saw Neil Armstrong walk on the moon. And I am convinced that had a pronounced impact on my desire to explore, to eventually go into space.
When it began, the space race was between governments, the United States and the Soviet Union, the only two entities in the 60s and 70s that could handle the cost and complexity of sending a human beyond Earth's atmosphere. That competition pushed them to innovate faster and to spend more. In the mid-1960s, NASA alone accounted for more than 4% of the entire federal budget. But as that era came to an end, the agency's legacy became not one only of pride and achievement, but also of waste.
When government does things, they can do very large projects, but they're not necessarily the most efficient. They can build the Panama Canal. They can build the Apollo program, but it won't necessarily be the most effective or the most efficient. I dealt in and I still do, in the aerospace and defense industry for many, many decades. I have companies that are still involved in defense acquisition. And when you involve the federal government, there are all sorts of rules and regulations to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. That requires a lot of oversight, a lot of procedures, a hell of a lot of paperwork. And by its very nature, government contracts tend to be much larger, much slower, much more expensive.
Since its beginning, NASA has worked with businesses. Its relationships with Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman span decades. But until recently, it oversaw every aspect of the design, construction, and operation of spacecraft, which by the 21st century led to ballooning costs, missed targets, and ultimately relying on Russia to get U.S. astronauts back into space. All that came to a head in 2010.
We could go into why we're doing this, but you can read numbers as well as I can, and I don't think I need to dwell on that. You know, when you have a program that's just going to cost a fortune to resurrect, and schedules are getting harder to make without much more money, then wisdom says you pick a new course. And so that's what we've done.
All three engines up and burning.
After 30 years of service, NASA retired its space shuttle and launched the Commercial Crew Program. Its goal? To bring competition back to a system that had grown unwieldy and unsustainable. Boeing and the others would still be in the mix, but there would be newer, smaller upstarts. The gates were open, and no longer would NASA draw the map and give companies directions to follow. Now, the agency would provide the destination, and it was up to businesses to find out how to get there. The race was back on.
A lot of late nights, a lot of early mornings, a lot of very stressful situations that we went through, but in the end, it was all worth it.
Laura Crabtree was part of the race at the ground level. She worked at SpaceX as a crew operations and resource engineer and was among those charged with answering NASA's call to take astronauts back to the International Space Station on board a U.S. craft. Over a period of 9 years, what began as a competition among more than half a dozen firms came down to just two, SpaceX and Boeing.
I think healthy competition is extremely good to keep people pushing boundaries. Without the competition with Boeing, I don't know if we would have all been as invigorated to get to the space station in 2020. As you know, a lot of things happened in 2020, and there were a lot of hardships for each and every one of us during those times. And I personally put a lot of things on hold to get that mission to the space station that year. If not for the competition, because we thought at the time that we were both probably launching in 2020, and we just wanted to be first. And so we pushed really, really hard to get there.
Liftoff of the Falcon 9 and Crew Dragon.
In the end, of course, it paid off. In May of 2020, astronauts flew to the ISS on a craft built by a company that hadn't even existed when the space station first launched.
We have Bob Behnken from SpaceX Demo 2 mission entering the International Space Station.
The moment was symbolized by the recovery of a small American flag that had been left behind in the space station by some of the very same astronauts. A modern-day version of that old game we played as kids called Capture the Flag.
This is the flag that we left here almost 9 years ago. And at some point after the end of the shuttle program, we decided we would have a little friendly competition to see who came up and got this flag. And congratulations, SpaceX, you got the flag.
I mean, there was a lot of relief. There was a lot of joy. All of us were up there, sitting on the floor, surrounding a couple of monitors that was at one of our cubicles, and just waiting until they opened the hatch to get the flag that had been left by the last shuttle crew.
As for Boeing, it would be 4 more years before it could get a crew to the space station. In fact, in the time it took for one crewed Boeing Starliner mission to reach the ISS, SpaceX sent up no fewer than 9 crewed missions. And they're doing it for far less money. The latest figures from NASA show the estimated average cost per astronaut for SpaceX was around $55 million. For Boeing, $90 million. And that's assuming things go according to plan. But they haven't.
NASA has decided that Butch and Sonny will return with Crew 9 next February, and that Starliner will return uncrewed.
Boeing's Starliner couldn't complete its first mission, and in September it returned back to Earth without its crew. So to bring them back, NASA turned once again to SpaceX.
What has been incredibly striking is just how much more rapid and more cost-effective and even more capable the private sector rocket industry is compared to the legacy government contractors and government itself like NASA and Boeing.
So what has made SpaceX more successful than Boeing? There's no one answer, but at least part of it comes down to culture and to the way the company not only learns from failure, but cheers it on.
Everyone here absolutely pumped to clear the pad and make it this far into the test flight, the first integrated flight of the booster and the Starship vehicle.
Starship just experienced what we call a rapid unscheduled disassembly, or a RUD, during ascent. But now this was a development test. This is the first test flight of Starship, and the goal was to gather the data.
And I think what's fascinating is how exemplified by SpaceX and Elon Musk is that they're willing to have rockets blow up in order to learn faster. And there's no question that it does, but I think that the culture of, say, a NASA or a large government contractor like Boeing would not exactly want to see their rockets blowing up on a pad to learn faster. And yet, it seems to be the case that that absolutely is the way that you can learn faster, make things cheaper, and iterate your designs much more rapidly.
And if you look with that SpaceX's relationship with NASA, it's been very different than the traditional contractor model.
Ron Epstein was an engineer for Boeing in the 1990s, and today he's managing director at Bank of America covering aerospace and defense.
You know, the old model was, hey, we want this vehicle, here are all the specs, build it to this spec, we'll buy it. Where SpaceX has more of a launch it, build it, try it, fix it, build it, try it, fix it. Right? I mean, on social media, their rocket launches, when they fail, get a lot of airplay, but they learn a lot and they move forward. So what you see with the Falcon 9 landing itself, I mean, who would imagine that could happen? And they do it now on a regular basis. It's almost boring now. You know, I say that tongue in cheek. I mean, it's always fascinating to watch, but who would imagine you'd have rockets that can come back and land themselves very accurately? Well, SpaceX figured that out. Build it, launch it, try it, break it, build it, launch it, try it, break it, and then you get there. And that's a very different mindset than the traditional, here's our spec, build it, deliver it. Ooh, it doesn't work, fix our spec. which turns out to be far more expensive, and I would argue probably doesn't get you there as quickly.
For its part, Boeing has had its own share of problems besides falling behind in space. After multiple Senate hearings surrounding the company's 737 MAX crisis, CEO Dave Calhoun stepped down. Kelly Ortberg took the helm in August. Boeing has a new CEO.
Yeah.
If you were going to advise him about what to do with Boeing's space operation, what would you tell him?
Yeah, it's a good question. Decide if he really wants it. And if you really want it, invest in it and attract that talent.
Liftoff. The United States has never known a space program without Boeing, and its absence could reshape the competition. But explorer and investor Victor Vescovo says today there is no shortage of companies fighting to find new and better ways to send humans back into space. Whether it is with or without Boeing, Vescovo still believes that America's story in outer space is just beginning.
We are explorers. We are human beings. And there is something about the connection of human beings walking on the moon that touched us at an almost spiritual level in the way that the first lander on the moon did not. The first person to walk on Mars will be a seminal event for humankind in a way that is probably orders of magnitude more profound and affecting to people in a positive way than the first Mars lander. And finally, I do believe that at some point in the future, human beings will not be confined to planet Earth. We need to explore our solar system. We need to make ourselves a multiplanetary species for our own survival, if nothing else. And therefore, I think, why not start now?
Talk of becoming a multiplanetary species may sound far-fetched, but maybe no more far-fetched than when, as a 9-year-old boy, I heard President Kennedy say that the United States would go to the moon before I graduated from high school.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Far-fetched, which made it all the more surprising when only 7 years later, I watched the black and white images of Neil Armstrong taking that one giant leap for mankind.
Beautiful view. Isn't that something?
That does it for us here on Wall Street Week. I'm David Westin. Join us again next week for more stories of capitalism.
You're listening to Bloomberg Wall Street Week with David Westin from Bloomberg Radio.